Today on Brilliance Business TV, we have Ishreen Bradley. Ishreen is passionate about all humans having a fair crack at work. Stay tuned. Welcome to Brilliance Business TV, conversations with leading experts in business. I am your host, Mark Stephen Pooler. We have a wonderful guest on the show today, Ishreen Bradley. Ishreen supports organisations to increase inclusion in the workplace. So a really interesting topic today. I want to make an official shout out to our show sponsors, Dreamweaver Artist Ranch. We are streaming live on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. We're also on the E360 TV network under Fresh Takes, going out to Apple TV, Fire TV, Android, Roku, and many more. We're also streaming on MSPNewsGlobal.com, and we're also on Business Innovators Radio Network. Let's bring in our incredible guest, Ishreen Bradley. Hey Ishreen, welcome to Brilliance Business TV.
Hi Mark. Hi Mark, lovely to be with you and be with everyone watching here.
I'm really looking forward to a great conversation with you today, Ishreen. Let's get started. I understand that your commitment is all about balancing the scales of relative privilege to empower equity at work. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means for you?
Yes, absolutely. Mark, I'm passionate that everyone has a fair crack at work, as you just told everyone. When I look back over my 35 plus years at work, what I have found gets in the way is the impact of privilege, and specifically what I call relative privilege. So let's take a look at what that all means. Let's start with privilege, right? So privilege is often invisible to the people who possess it, but it's always there for people who don't.
Yes.
So people who possess privilege can either consciously or subconsciously or even unconsciously use their privilege over others. And those others will almost always perceive this use of privilege as seeking an advantage over them. Whether that perceived privilege comes from a birthright or race or politics or education or sexuality or one of many different points of privilege. As a society, we typically assume that privilege belongs to the dominant group. So in the UK, the dominant group at work would be your white, middle-aged, middle-class man. And that term has started to be called white privilege. And this term white privilege post the murder of George Floyd was used a lot, and it's caused somewhat of a backlash. And so people are a bit nervous about discussing privilege, but I think it's really important that we do. And, you know, given that the white privilege has taken attention away from the fact that there are privileged parts of a person's identity that can bestow privilege even within a marginalized group. So that's what I call relative privilege. So let me give you an example. Way back 35 or so years ago, when I first started work, I was an engineer. I was in an office, and I noticed one thing. There was one colleague there who always seemed to get the least exciting projects. Okay, so let's call him Ashok for the purpose of this conversation. Ashok grew up in India. He managed to go to university in this country, and he was in his 40s, an Asian, brown-skinned man, right? And then there was me, young, everything in her 20s, she grew up in the UK. And I found that I usually got the projects I wanted. So I became fascinated about why Ashok didn't. And here's what I realized, and I didn't have this language back then, but I do now. See, what I realized is that although Ashok had relative privilege over me in terms of being male and having more experience, I had relative privilege over him by virtue of having grown up in this country and being able to code check so that people could relate to me much more easily than they could to Ashok. And so they tended to give me the kind of work that I asked for because they kind of felt I was one of them. They understood me. So, what you can see from this is that relative privilege is really subtle and it's often easily overlooked. So, my commitment is that everybody at work has the opportunity of success, which requires that the organization's culture enables each person to reach what I call the baseline, despite the level of relative privilege that they may or may not have. So, if we use a metaphor here, metaphorically, you can think of this as the starting line in an athletic race. So, the difference is that in this race, not everyone is at the starting line. Some people will be ahead because they have more relative privilege. Some people will be behind the starting line because they have less relative privilege. And in what many organizations describe themselves as being a meritocratic organization, relative privilege is often hidden and not accounted for. So, what we say is that the organization's culture, their policies, their processes, their systems are all levers that they can tune to ensure that everybody has a fair opportunity of success. And that's what we focus on. So, we enable organizations to adjust those levers so that they have a culture in which everybody has a fair chance of success and they're empowered. And that's important because many organizations today are committed to having equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and to achieving a socially just culture at work. So that's my commitment. It's all about enabling clients to balance the scales of relative privilege by adjusting those levers, even to empower equity at work.
I hear you. It's really important work that you're doing, Ishreen, and who benefits from this?
So the thing is, there are benefits for um, the individual, obviously, the individual, whether they have more or less relative privilege, but also for the team and for the organization. So, if we start with the organization, an organization that has a just culture that enables equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging by stewarding and curating the relative privilege within the organization will be able to attract and retain the talent they need. And, in this environment, my clients, the biggest challenge they're facing is attracting and retaining good talent. So, you'll be able to do that. They'll be able to improve their brand reputation and their employee and their customer proposition. And because of that, they'll attract more customers, increase their sales, and increase their profitability. Now, as a team, you're going to be able to increase engagement within the team. So it's just a much more enjoyable, positive environment to work in. And you'll increase the productivity of the team, which is really, really important in today's competitive environment. Now, for the individual gets to feel safe, feel valued, and to make a positive contribution to the work environment and then beyond in the society they live in. And you might think, so what about that, right? But the so what about that is that it has been proven in lots of reports about happiness and mental well-being and happiness at work that the thing that causes people to be most happy is to make a positive contribution to another person. So people with more relative privilege can increase their happiness index by doing this, by contributing more to others and learning how to curate and steward their privilege.
And how do you go about fulfilling on this commitment?
So do you know what? I'm so passionate about this that I set up an organization, my business called Belonging Pioneers, to do just this, right? So we do that in two ways. We work with organizations to realize an equitable, inclusive culture where people from diverse backgrounds and different levels of relative privilege can experience a sense of belonging and the opportunity of success, where the majority group can be empowered in stewarding their privilege and being happier as well. And that's what I was talking about when I said, adjusting those levers. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is that we empower people who are from different backgrounds, so the diverse leaders in the organization, to be successful by gaining the tools and the strategies that can get them to that starting line, to that baseline and beyond.
Tell me more about your research into the impact of privilege at work, Ishreen.
Sure, Mark. So, look, the subject of relative privilege and its use and impact on people in the workplace has come up for us many times in working with clients during our workshops and the different kinds of conversations we have with them. So, we conducted a quick review of what exists out there in terms of research into relative privilege. And, we found there's a lot of research about diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging, but we were surprised to find that there's very little specifically about privilege and relative privilege and the impact that has on equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So, through our research program, we set out to understand how widespread the use of privilege is in today's workplace and the impact that has on people and on organizations, and also the potential benefits of having the right policies that could mitigate the use of relative privilege and the impact that has on people at work. So, when we launched the research, there were a number of really high profile stories and cases of people who'd abused their privilege and their entitlement. And so it seemed to us to perfectly illustrate that there's like a collective and organizational penalty for that, as well as how the use of privilege impacts the individual, the protagonist of abusing privilege. And we also saw many cases where the perceived progress to a more moral and equal environment at work was undermined when people who saw bad behavior or a use of privilege and abuse were forced to suppress their concerns or told not to talk about it. So we thought there's a real need for this research. And the purpose of the research is to understand the prevalence and the impact of privilege in the workplace, and to go further and to support the case for action that can mitigate the prevalence and the impact of harmful use of privilege in its many forms, not only to protect the individuals and organizations involved, but also to encourage the use of policies and guidance and systems and structures and behaviors and habits that support the growth of a morally just and equal workplace. So, I spoke about some of the benefits earlier. Those benefits are all substantiated by the research, which has already had more than 40 organizations taking part. And, what's interesting for me is that people who've completed that research, they've said that they've learned just through the process of doing the research themselves, and that this research is ongoing, and we'd really welcome everybody contributing to it. So I think there'll be a link somewhere later on in our talk. Please do click on that or go to our website and you'll be able to access the research survey and take part in it and share it with your organization.
We will share that shortly, Ishreen. Now, I saw on LinkedIn that your event on UN World Day of Social Justice had a big impact on some movers and shakers in the ESG field. What were the key highlights, Ishreen?
Yes, Mark, I was so happy with the high caliber of people who joined us and contributed to its success. You know, we had really senior people from the workplace. Um, we had Chris Williams, who's the global DEI director at CBRE. We had Julie Baker, who's the head of the whole enterprise and environment initiatives at NatWest Group, and so people like that. And, you know, given that our vision at Belonging Pioneers is to balance the scales towards a culture of equity at work, and we know that it requires people to understand and work to balance those inequities that we find in the workplace that are based on different levels of relative privilege. um, you know, that's the core work we do, and that's what we do for our clients. But we also contribute to the future reality of that vision by advancing the UN social sustainable development goals, sustainable development goals 8 and 10, and also by balancing the scales uh, through our charity partner, Hope for Children, by fundraising for children who don't have the kinds of privileges that we enjoy today. So I was really delighted to be joined by those great people. And the event enabled us to really forward the realization of those UN goals and our personal organizational vision and raise funds for our charity partner. And in the event, we explored how organizations can put more S into ESG. So that's the social element of environment, social governance. And we did that by looking at the impact of socioeconomic privilege, health privilege, and digital privilege. So, how do those three aspects introduce relative privilege into the workplace? And what can you do to balance the scales with those three aspects? So, you know, I was also really delighted that there were experts in their fields join us. So, for example, Anil Soni, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the World Health Organization Foundation, he committed time to our event, and he and our other speakers really enriched the conversation and gave many dimensions to it. And you know, people said how it was uplifting, how it's an educational and entertaining, knowledge sharing and social event. And NatWest kindly provided some delicious food. So it really was a great social event as well. And it enabled us to raise funds for our charity.
Congratulations on all the success, Ishreen. What are your highlights from the International Women's Month?
So, International Women's Month last month, I was really blessed to be at many events where important conversations were had about how to empower equity during International Women's Month. You might know Empower Equity was the theme for this year's International Women's Month. My two favorite events. So the first was the Hertfordshire Women in Leadership Conference, which with just some amazing women and men really looking at how they can advocate for each other in success, and the WISE conference. So the WISE conference, WISE is Women in Science and Engineering, which is where we really have a dearth of talent, you know, and we really need to encourage more talent. And they focused on women returners. How do you encourage women to return to work? So it was particularly great for us because our focus is with what we call the STEAM sectors. So science, technology, engineering, the arts and mathematics. And obviously women in science and engineering focuses very much in that space. And I was invited to run a workshop on imposter syndrome. And, you know, Mark, I continue to be surprised that imposter syndrome is still a challenge for so many people, men and women, who joined our workshop. And despite all the various books and the trainings and the YouTube videos, like there's so much information about imposter syndrome, but it continues to be one of the main challenges. And it was spoken about consistently at both these events. So I was really happy that we could provide our session. Imposter syndrome is one of the 12 lunch and learn topics in our diverse leader development program. You know, that's the second thing of the two things I said we do a lot of. And so I was invited to run that workshop with their audience. And we took our typical multi-dimensional, multi-sensory approach. And I was just really happy that people reported back that they got huge benefit and even wanted to take it back to their organization and share. I've got a little online imposter syndrome quiz that people were like, can I share it with my team? And, you know, and I've heard back from them since, and it's just made me really happy to know that it was a benefit to people who joined us.
Wonderful. What 3 things can our audience do to put more S into their ESG?
So, Mark, you know, this S, the social aspect of ESG, is the one that gets the least focus. It's the least acted upon. And I think that's because it's just more complex. It's less defined. So people find it very challenging. You know, the environment is really easy, right? We want to achieve 30% decarbonization. That's, you know, it's not easy to do, but it's easy to get your head around. Whereas the S, as a more socially just workplace, is just less clear. So people do find it very difficult. But the thing is, it's the glue, it's in the middle, because it's the glue that brings together the possibility of a better working environment for everyone. And that'll bring more ethics, that'll bring better governance. So for me, it's the most important part. So what we know is putting more S into your ESG will definitely be difficult, but it'll also definitely improve your employee proposition, and it'll enable you to attract and retain good talent. And what I've done here for you in terms of the 3 things that you can do is break it down into absorbable elements. And that's how we approach this work. So I suggest that for you listeners, the following will be good next steps and reasonably easy to do. So the first thing is join us. We've got an online version of Balancing the Scales 2023, which has all the resources and the toolkits and and additional reports that you can use to learn about the topic and learn about how you can go about it. You'll see all the videos, including Anil and Shital and Tammy, and you'll be able to really absorb from their contribution. You'll see a QR code on the screen there. If you take your camera and scan that QR code, that'll take you to a little form that you just need to complete, and it'll take you straight into the online resource, the website that contains all this important information. The second thing is, once you go there, you'll find a guide to the Privilege Walk. The Privilege Walk, we did this at the event, and it was just so effective. People had a felt sense of the relative privilege of each person in the room, and had a personal sense of their own relative privilege. A very powerful exercise. Many people who came to the event are using that. So download that guide, which is in this website that you go to when you scan the QR code and fill out the form, and see if you can do that with your organization. And the third thing is, please do complete the Privilege Conundrum survey. You can do that for yourself, see what that's like. And then if you find, and most people have found, that it makes a difference for you, and it would be useful to know where your organization is with respect to those different levers, then you can do that with your team. Let us know. We can set up a specific session for your organization or your team, and you'll get a specific report. So those are my top 3 tips. Explore the content on Balancing the Scale, do the Privilege Trail Walk, download that guide, and thirdly, complete the Privilege Conundrum survey.
I love it. I would encourage all those people out there who this is in resonance with to explore Balancing the Scales. Scan the QR code right now. Ishreen, I have thoroughly enjoyed having a conversation with you. Thank you so much for being my guest today on Brilliance Business TV.
My pleasure. It's a real delight to be with you, Mark, and thank you for the great conversation.
The pleasure's been all mine, Ishreen. Thank you everyone for watching Brilliance Business TV, conversations with leading experts in business. Until next time, bye for now.